"Don't sign that contract, Your Excellency." The sentence cut through the private dining room so softly that, for a moment, nobody reacted. The crystal chandelier still shimmered above the 12-seat mahogany table. The skyline of Manhattan still glowed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A waiter still poured sparkling water into a silver-rimmed glass somewhere near the wall. But then the billionaire Sheikh slowly stopped moving. His gold pen froze less than an inch above the final signature line of a $200 million agreement. Silence spread across the room like cold air before a storm. Ethan Blackwell lifted his eyes first. Slow, sharp, dangerous. The billionaire investor sat at the head of the table in a charcoal Brioni suit worth more than most people's monthly rent, his steel-gray eyes narrowing toward the source of the interruption. A waitress, blonde hair tied neatly behind her neck, black uniform, white apron, calm expression. She stood beside the coffee cart holding a silver pot in both hands as though she suddenly regretted speaking at all. The attorneys exchanged confused glances. One of the executives let out a quiet laugh under his breath. Sheikh Omar al-Hadid did not laugh. His dark eyes remained fixed on the young waitress. "You speak Arabic?" he asked quietly. The woman swallowed once before answering in fluent Gulf Arabic, her pronunciation smooth enough to make the room visibly tense. "The contract was altered on page 7, sir. The ownership clause no longer says partnership. It says permanent transfer." The translator standing beside the sheik instantly stiffened. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. The city lights reflected against the crystal whiskey glass in his hand as he studied her with open suspicion now. "What exactly is your name?" he asked. "Clara," she answered softly. "Clara Whitmore." The translator interrupted immediately, his smile thin and strained. "Mr. Blackwell, with respect, she's mistaken. Legal Arabic can sound different to untrained speakers." Clara looked at him for the first time. Her expression did not change. "Then read line 42 again," she said quietly. The room fell still once more. The translator hesitated, only for a second. But Ethan noticed. Billionaires survived because they noticed hesitation. Sheikh Omar slowly slid the contract across the table toward Clara. "Read it yourself," he said. Several people immediately protested. One attorney nearly stood from his chair. "Sir, we can't let restaurant staff interfere in a—" "Read it," the sheik repeated. Clara carefully placed the coffee pot down onto the serving cart. Ethan watched her hands. No shaking now, no panic, just control. She stepped toward the table beneath the warm amber lighting of the private suite, the soft click of her shoes almost echoing against the silence. Then she began reading the Arabic text aloud. Her voice was low, smooth, precise. Every syllable landed like another crack spreading through glass. Ethan did not understand Arabic fluently, but he understood the reaction unfolding around him. One lawyer suddenly reached for the document. Another executive went pale. Sheikh Omar's jaw slowly tightened, and the translator stopped breathing normally altogether. Clara reached the final sentence and gently closed the folder. "If he signed this tonight," she said quietly in English, "your company would gain control of his ports within 18 months through a holding corporation in Cyprus." Nobody spoke. Somewhere far below the tower, a siren echoed through midtown traffic. Ethan Blackwell stared at the waitress standing beside his billion-dollar negotiation table and realized something deeply unfamiliar was happening to him for the very first time in years. He was no longer the smartest person in the room. The silence inside the private dining suite lasted almost 10 full seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a glass. Even the pianist downstairs in the main restaurant seemed distant now, his music reduced to a faint echo beneath the pressure hanging over the room. Ethan Blackwell slowly placed his whiskey glass onto the table without taking his eyes off Clara Whitmore. "Show me the clause," he said quietly. Clara nodded once and reopened the contract beneath the warm chandelier light. Her fingers moved calmly across the Arabic text until they stopped halfway down the page. "Here," she said. "This wording looks standard to non-native readers because the legal structure is intentionally old-fashioned." One of the attorneys adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. Clara continued speaking carefully. almost like a professor explaining something to students who suddenly realized they were unprepared for the lesson. The original draft used the phrase for temporary operational stewardship. This version changes it to irreversible asset control through delegated inheritance authority. The attorney frowned. That is impossible. Those terms are almost identical. In modern Arabic, yes, Clara replied softly, but not in Gulf legal dialect from maritime contracts. Sheikh Omar slowly exhaled through his nose. Ethan noticed the man's knuckles tightening around the edge of the table. How much would he lose? Ethan asked. Clara looked directly at the sheikh before answering. Everything connected to the port expansion within 2 years. Possibly more if litigation followed. The room shifted after that. Quiet panic moved across expensive suits and polished cufflinks. Phones appeared beneath the table. One executive stepped into the hallway, whispering urgently into a Bluetooth headset. The translator standing near the wall suddenly looked pale beneath the restaurant lighting. Ethan stood from his chair at last. Tall, controlled, calm in the terrifying way powerful men often were. "Lock the room," he said quietly to his head of security. Nobody argued. The heavy doors closed immediately. Clara instinctively stepped backward. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I should not have interrupted." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "If you had not interrupted," he replied, $200 million would have disappeared before midnight. Sheikh Omar slowly removed the gold pen from the contract folder and set it down beside his untouched espresso. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "where exactly did you learn to read legal Gulf Arabic?" Clara hesitated. Ethan noticed that hesitation too. Small, almost invisible, but real. "My father taught Middle Eastern diplomatic translation at Columbia," she answered quietly. "I grew up around the language." One of the lawyers stared at her in disbelief. "You are telling me a restaurant waitress understands maritime acquisition law better than our translation team?" Clara lowered her eyes slightly. "No, sir," she answered politely. "I am saying somebody hoped you would not." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. The security chief suddenly approached Ethan and handed him a tablet. Ethan scanned the information quickly, his expression darkening with every line. Then he looked toward the translator. "You wired $3 million to an offshore account in Malta last week," Ethan said quietly. The translator froze. Nobody spoke again. Outside the windows, rain had begun sliding down the Manhattan skyline in silver streaks. Clara immediately stepped away from the table, almost as though she wanted to disappear back into the background where she belonged. But Ethan noticed something now that he had missed before. She moved like someone educated, controlled, careful. Even the way she carried silence felt different from everyone else in the room. Not timid, measured. Sheikh Omar slowly rose to his feet and looked directly at Clara. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you protected my family's company." Clara gave a small polite nod. "I only translated the truth." Ethan watched her face carefully after she said that. No arrogance, no excitement, no desire for recognition, just quiet certainty. And somehow that unsettled him more than the fraud itself. Rain washed across the glass walls of the restaurant as midnight crept closer over Manhattan. Most of the dinner guests downstairs had already gone home, leaving only scattered conversations beneath the soft jazz drifting through the marble corridors. But inside the private suite on the 42nd floor, nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. The unsigned contract still sat in the middle of the mahogany table like something radioactive. Ethan Blackwell had not touched it in nearly 20 minutes. Instead, he watched Clara Whitmore quietly refill water glasses near the corner of the room as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. That unsettled him more than the fraud itself. Most people changed the moment powerful men noticed them. Their voices shifted, their posture straightened, their eyes searched for opportunity. Clara did none of that. She moved carefully between crystal glasses and silver plates with the same calm rhythm she had before stopping a $200 million disaster. "Miss Whitmore," Sheikh Omar called gently. Clara paused immediately. "Yes, sir." The older billionaire studied her with visible curiosity now. You recognized a legal dialect most international firms would miss. Yet you work night shifts carrying coffee trays. Clara offered a small polite smile. Life changes directions sometimes. Ethan finally spoke again. That is not an answer. His voice was low, calm, controlled. Clara turned toward him slowly. Under the amber lighting, her blue eyes looked almost silver against the dark restaurant walls. "No, Mr. Blackwell," she replied softly. "It is the only answer I have." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to read someone completely. He hated that feeling. One of his attorneys suddenly approached the table holding a second contract folder. "We confirmed the modifications," the man said carefully. There were 6 hidden transfer mechanisms buried through translation inconsistencies. Sheikh Omar closed his eyes briefly. 6. Yes, sir. Ethan looked toward the translator still seated near the far wall beneath security supervision. The man avoided eye contact entirely now, sweat visible near his collar despite the cool air conditioning. Ethan had seen fear before. Boardrooms were built on it. But Clara showed none. She simply stood near the serving cart folding linen napkins with quiet precision, as though chaos did not impress her anymore. "You knew immediately," Ethan said suddenly. Clara looked up. "Excuse me?" "The second you heard the phrase." Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "You did not need to review the contract twice. You already understood what they were trying to do." Clara hesitated for half a heartbeat. "My father used to say legal deception sounds different from honest language," she answered quietly. "People who lie always make words heavier than necessary." Sheikh Omar gave a faint smile at that. "Your father sounds like a wise man." For the first time that evening, something shifted in Clara's expression. Small, fragile, a shadow passing briefly across calm water. "He was," she whispered. Then she lowered her eyes again and continued folding the napkins. Ethan noticed the old silver watch resting beneath her sleeve as she moved. Worn leather band, scratched glass, carefully preserved, not fashionable, sentimental. He found himself wondering how many things about Clara Whitmore had been quietly hidden beneath that black waitress uniform. An assistant entered the suite moments later carrying a tablet. "Mr. Blackwell," she said nervously, "your Tokyo call is waiting." Ethan barely looked at her. "Cancel it." The assistant blinked in surprise. "Sir, the investors flew in from—" "Cancel it?" Ethan repeated calmly. The woman immediately nodded and disappeared. Clara looked up at him then, clearly confused. Ethan Blackwell never canceled meetings. Entire industries adjusted schedules around him. Yet tonight he remained seated in silence beside a waitress who had dismantled an international scam using nothing but language and instinct. Outside the windows, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the Hudson River. The city lights shimmered against the rain. And for reasons Ethan could not fully explain yet, he suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that Clara Whitmore was hiding something much bigger than her ability to speak Arabic. The restaurant finally emptied just after 1 in the morning. Downstairs, staff members quietly stacked chairs and polished wine glasses beneath dimmed chandeliers, while rain continued sliding across the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. But the private suite remained awake, tense, silent. Ethan Blackwell stood near the glass wall with one hand in his pocket, staring out across Manhattan as security teams escorted the translator from the building through a private elevator. Nobody in the room spoke until the elevator doors closed. Then Sheikh Omar slowly loosened the cuff of his dark navy suit and looked toward Clara again. "You saved me from humiliation tonight," he said quietly. Clara shook her head once. "No, sir. I only stopped someone else from abusing your trust." The older billionaire smiled faintly at that. "Those are not always different things." Ethan remained silent beside the window. His reflection stared back at him through the rain-covered glass. Cold eyes, sharp jawline, perfect control. The image business magazines loved to print beside words like ruthless and untouchable. Yet tonight, none of that control felt complete anymore, because every answer Clara gave seemed to create 3 new questions. One of the attorneys closed the final contract folder and exhaled heavily. This operation was sophisticated, he admitted. The wording was hidden beneath obsolete maritime terminology from the Gulf region. Honestly, most firms in New York would have missed it entirely. Clara quietly gathered empty coffee cups from the table. Most firms in New York do not expect intelligence to wear an apron, she said softly. The room went still again. Ethan turned around slowly. Not offended. Interested. That was somehow worse. You think people underestimate you, he said. Clara placed the final cup onto the silver tray. I think people see uniforms before they see people. Nobody argued with her, because nobody in that room could honestly say she was wrong. Sheikh Omar reached into his suit jacket and removed a sleek black business card embossed in gold Arabic lettering. Come work for my legal team in Dubai, he said calmly. Several executives immediately looked shocked. Clara blinked once in surprise. Sir, you understand language the way seasoned diplomats do, the Sheikh continued. And unlike most experts, you are not blinded by ego. Clara lowered her eyes politely. That is generous. But I cannot. Ethan finally stepped away from the window. Why not? Clara hesitated. My mother is sick. The answer landed softly inside the quiet room. No drama. No self-pity. Just truth. Ethan watched her expression carefully now. For the first time that night, the invisible wall around Clara Whitmore seemed thinner somehow. Human. Real. Hospital bills? Ethan asked. Clara nodded once. Among other things. Ethan glanced toward the worn silver watch resting against her wrist again. He suddenly realized she never touched her phone. Never checked messages. Never sought attention from anyone around her. She behaved like someone carrying responsibilities much heavier than herself. One of the restaurant managers nervously entered the suite moments later. Miss Whitmore, he said carefully. Your shift ended an hour ago. You should head home. Clara gave a polite nod. Of course. She reached for her coat hanging beside the doorway. Simple gray wool. Slightly worn at the sleeves. Ethan noticed that too. A woman fluent in diplomatic Arabic should not have been taking the subway home after midnight carrying coffee stains on her uniform. The math did not make sense. As Clara prepared to leave, Sheikh Omar stood and placed his hand gently over his heart. In my culture, he said quietly, honor matters more than money. Tonight you protected both. Clara looked genuinely uncomfortable receiving praise. Thank you, sir. Then she turned toward the door. Ethan spoke before she could leave. Miss Whitmore. Clara paused. Yes, Mr. Blackwell? Ethan studied her for a long moment beneath the soft amber lighting. Tomorrow morning, he said calmly. I want you to come to my office. Clara frowned slightly. Why? Ethan's eyes narrowed just enough to reveal the truth beneath his calm voice. Because nobody spends years serving tables with your level of intelligence unless something forced them to disappear. The rain outside grew heavier. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around her coat sleeve. Just enough for Ethan to notice. And in that moment he realized two things at once. First, he was right. Second, Clara Whitmore was suddenly afraid. Clara Whitmore stood motionless beside the private dining room door while rain hammered softly against the skyscraper windows behind her. Ethan Blackwell's words still lingered in the air between them. Nobody spends years serving tables with your level of intelligence unless something forced them to disappear. The room had gone completely still again. Even Sheikh Omar quietly watched her now with the calm patience of someone accustomed to hidden truths. Clara tightened her grip slightly on her gray coat before finally answering. I did not disappear, Mr. Blackwell, she said softly. I just stopped being noticed. Ethan studied her carefully. Those are not the same thing. Clara gave the smallest hint of a tired smile. Sometimes they are. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Clara nodded politely toward the room. Thank you for your kindness tonight, gentlemen. She turned toward the door before Ethan interrupted again. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Clara paused without facing him. Mr. Blackwell? My office, he repeated calmly. No press. No lawyers. Just a conversation. Clara slowly looked back over her shoulder. And if I say no? Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket. Then I will spend the next 6 months wondering why a woman fluent in Gulf legal Arabic is carrying coffee trays in Midtown. Sheikh Omar laughed quietly beneath his breath for the first time all evening. Clara looked down briefly, almost hiding a reluctant smile of her own. You always this persistent? She asked softly. Only when something does not make sense. Clara considered him for several seconds. Then she nodded once. 9 o'clock. Ethan watched her leave through the private hallway until the elevator doors finally closed behind her. Only then did he exhale slowly and loosen the knot of his tie for the first time that night. Sheikh Omar approached beside him carrying 2 untouched espresso cups. You are curious about her, the older billionaire observed. Ethan accepted one of the cups without looking away from the elevator. I do not like unanswered questions. No, Sheikh Omar replied thoughtfully. I think perhaps you do not like realizing you judged someone incorrectly. Ethan finally glanced toward him. The sheik only smiled knowingly and sipped his espresso. Meanwhile, 30 floors below, Clara stepped out into the cold Manhattan rain alone. The city smelled like wet concrete, traffic, and distant steam rising through subway grates. Her shoes splashed softly against the sidewalk as black SUVs passed beneath glowing traffic lights. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and walked 3 blocks before descending into the subway station downtown. Nobody looked twice at her there. That was the strange comfort of New York City. Billionaires signed contracts above the clouds while exhausted waitresses rode underground beside construction workers, nurses, and students carrying grocery bags home after midnight. Clara sat quietly inside the nearly empty subway car as rainwater traced silver lines across the windows. Her reflection looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Tired eyes. Loose strands of blonde hair escaping her bun. The old silver watch still resting against her wrist like a memory she refused to let go. Her phone buzzed suddenly. One message. Did you finish work safely? Clara's expression softened immediately. She typed back quickly. Yes. Coming home now. Do not wait up. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. I heated soup for you anyway. Clara smiled faintly despite herself. The train rattled beneath the city, while strangers sat in silence around her staring at phones and advertisements overhead. But Clara barely noticed any of it anymore. Her mind remained fixed on Ethan Blackwell's final words. Something forced them to disappear. Most people assumed poverty looked loud, chaotic, obvious. They never understood how often it arrived quietly instead. One unpaid hospital bill. One funeral. One wrong decision. One person getting sick at the wrong time. Clara closed her eyes briefly as the train disappeared deeper beneath Manhattan. Across the city, Ethan Blackwell stood alone inside his penthouse office staring at a digital profile his security team had already assembled overnight. Employment records, address history, academic transcripts. Then his eyes narrowed suddenly at a single line buried halfway down the report. Columbia University, Department of Linguistics and Middle Eastern Studies. Full academic scholarship. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. Because the records showed Clara Whitmore had not dropped out due to poor grades. She had vanished 1 semester before graduation without explanation. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwell felt something dangerously close to obsession. By 8:30 the next morning, Manhattan already looked expensive again. Black SUVs lined the curb outside Blackwell Global Headquarters, while men in tailored suits crossed the marble lobby carrying coffees and glowing tablets beneath giant digital stock tickers. High above the city on the 61st floor, Ethan Blackwell stood alone beside the windows of his office watching helicopters move across the gray morning sky. He had not slept much. The file on Clara Whitmore still rested open across his desk beside untouched coffee. Columbia University, top of her department, advanced linguistic certifications, international legal translation internship offers. Then nothing. No graduation. No professional employment. Just restaurant jobs scattered across New York City over the last 4 years. Ethan hated missing pieces. They bothered him in the same way unfinished equations bothered mathematicians. His assistant quietly entered carrying a tablet. "Your 9 o'clock canceled their meeting to accommodate you, sir." Ethan barely looked up. "Reschedule them." "Again?" she asked carefully. Ethan finally lifted his eyes. "Do you have concerns, Melissa?" "No, sir." She immediately lowered her gaze. Nobody questioned Ethan Blackwell twice. The office fell quiet again after she left. Ethan turned back toward the skyline just as the elevator doors opened softly behind him. Clara Whitmore stepped into the office wearing the same gray coat from the night before. No designer handbag. No jewelry beyond the old silver watch resting against her wrist. She looked slightly uncomfortable standing among floor-to-ceiling glass walls, abstract art worth 6 figures, and furniture polished so perfectly it barely looked real. But she did not look intimidated. Ethan noticed that immediately. Most people entered his office already trying to impress him. Clara simply looked like someone trying not to take up too much space. "You came," Ethan said calmly. Clara removed her coat slowly. "You sounded like a man who does not enjoy hearing no." Ethan almost smiled again. "Almost. Coffee?" "No, thank you." Ethan gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Clara sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap while morning light spilled across the office windows behind her. For several seconds, Ethan simply studied her. Not the waitress uniform this time. Not the private restaurant lighting. Daylight changed things. She looked younger somehow. More tired too. "You investigated me," Clara said quietly. Not a question. Ethan sat across from her. "I verify people connected to $200 million fraud investigations." Clara nodded once. "Fair." Ethan slid the university file gently across the desk toward her. Clara's expression changed the moment she saw the Columbia logo. Small, quick, pain hidden beneath control. "Full scholarship," Ethan said quietly. "Top of your department." Professors described you as one of the strongest linguistic analysts they had seen in years. Clara stared at the file silently. "Then you vanished." The office remained still except for distant rain tapping softly against the glass. Clara finally looked up at him. "My father died." Ethan said nothing. 3 weeks later my mother got sick." Her voice remained calm, but Ethan noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly together. Hospital bills replaced tuition. Translation internships stopped mattering after that. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. "So you left Columbia to become a waitress?" Clara gave a faint, tired smile. "No one leaves Columbia planning to become a waitress." The honesty of the answer landed harder than Ethan expected. Clara looked down briefly toward the skyline below them. "At first I thought it would only be temporary," she admitted softly. "A few months. Maybe a year." Ethan watched her carefully. "And then?" Clara's eyes drifted toward the rain outside the windows. "Then life became expensive." Silence settled gently between them after that. Not awkward. Human. Ethan suddenly realized something uncomfortable again. Clara Whitmore never once sounded ashamed of honest work. Only tired of being underestimated because of it. His assistant knocked softly before entering once more. "Sir," she said nervously. "Sheikh Omar is on line 1. Ethan never took his eyes off Clara. "Tell him I will call back." The assistant blinked in surprise again before quietly leaving. Clara frowned slightly. "You keep canceling important people for this conversation." Ethan folded his hands calmly on the desk. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "you became important the moment you walked into that dining room and saw what nobody else could." Clara lowered her eyes again, almost uncomfortable beneath the sincerity in his voice. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwell realized he was speaking to someone who genuinely did not care whether billionaires approved of her or not. The rain had stopped by the time Clara left Blackwell Global Headquarters, but the city still looked washed in silver beneath the cloudy Manhattan sky. Steam drifted upward from street grates while yellow taxis rolled past rows of black SUVs parked outside the tower. Clara walked quietly through the crowded sidewalk with her gray coat pulled close against the cold wind, trying to ignore the strange weight Ethan Blackwell's words had left behind. You became important the moment you walked into that dining room and saw what nobody else could. Powerful men had noticed her intelligence before. Professors, diplomats, recruiters. But attention always came with expectations attached to it. Debt, obligation, ownership disguised as opportunity. Clara had learned long ago that survival often depended on staying invisible. Meanwhile, 61 floors above the city, Ethan remained seated behind his desk staring at the empty chair Clara had occupied only minutes earlier. His assistant carefully entered once more carrying another file. "Sir," Melissa said quietly, "our legal department traced the offshore transfer accounts." Ethan looked up. "And the shell corporations connect back to Victor Langley." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. Victor Langley, Senior Acquisitions Executive. One of the most trusted men in his company for nearly 11 years. Melissa placed the file carefully onto the desk. "The fraud investigation suggests he has been redirecting international assets through legal translation loopholes for at least 3 years. Ethan opened the file slowly. Numbers, contracts, foreign accounts, hidden ownership structures buried beneath obscure wording almost impossible for ordinary firms to catch. Almost impossible, but not impossible for Clara Whitmore. Ethan leaned back in silence. Then his eyes suddenly narrowed at a familiar phrase buried halfway through one translated report from Dubai. The wording looked almost identical to the manipulated clause Clara had exposed the night before. Ethan immediately pressed the intercom button. "Melissa." "Yes, sir?" "Find me every international contract reviewed internally during the last 3 years involving Gulf translation disputes." "All of them. All of them." Melissa hesitated briefly. "Sir, that could take days." Ethan closed the file carefully. "Then start now." Across town, Clara climbed the narrow stairs of her apartment building carrying 2 grocery bags and a pharmacy envelope tucked beneath her arm. The building smelled faintly of old radiators and laundry detergent. Nothing glamorous, nothing polished. Just ordinary life stacked across 6 aging floors in Queens. Clara quietly unlocked apartment 6B and stepped inside. Warm soup and old jazz music immediately greeted her from the kitchen. "You are late," her mother called gently. Clara smiled despite herself. "I know." Margaret Whitmore stood near the stove wrapped in a soft blue cardigan. Silver strands of hair falling loosely around tired eyes that still carried traces of the elegance Clara remembered from childhood university dinners and embassy receptions. Illness had made her thinner over the years, but not smaller somehow. "Long shift?" Margaret asked softly. Clara placed the groceries down carefully. "Something like that." Her mother studied her face immediately. "What happened?" Clara laughed quietly under her breath. "How do mothers always know?" "Because daughters think silence hides everything." Clara lowered her eyes slightly at that. Margaret slowly approached and touched her hand gently. "Clara." The younger woman finally exhaled. "A billionaire asked me why I disappeared." Margaret's expression softened with immediate understanding. "Ah." Clara looked away toward the small apartment window overlooking the crowded street below. "He looked at me like the answer mattered." "And that frightened you?" Clara hesitated. "A little." Her mother smiled sadly. "Because being truly seen always does." Clara sat quietly at the tiny kitchen table while rainwater still clung to the edges of the windows outside. "He investigated my university records," she admitted softly. Margaret sat beside her. "Then he knows you were brilliant." Clara gave a faint, tired smile. "No, he knows I quit." Her mother gently reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. "Those are not the same thing." Clara looked down silently. For years she had convinced herself they were. Back in Manhattan, Ethan Blackwell stood alone inside his office long after sunset reviewing translation files line by line beneath the glow of city lights. Then suddenly, near midnight, he froze. One contract from Dubai contained correction notes attached anonymously 3 years earlier. Legal wording adjustments. Maritime ownership clarifications. Gulf dialect revisions. Ethan slowly opened the attached translator identification record. Contributor, C. Whitmore. Ethan stared at the screen in silence. Because Clara Whitmore had not just saved him once. She had already saved his company years ago without ever asking for recognition. The next 48 hours changed everything inside Blackwell Global. Executives stopped speaking confidently in meetings. Legal teams worked through the night beneath fluorescent office lights, reviewing years of international contracts line by line. Entire departments suddenly realized how many decisions had depended on translations nobody important had ever bothered to verify properly. And at the center of all of it stood one uncomfortable truth. A waitress had seen what billion-dollar corporations missed. Ethan Blackwell did not publicly discuss Clara Whitmore with anyone, but privately her name appeared everywhere now. On legal review requests, archived contract audits, international compliance reports. Melissa entered Ethan's office just after 7 in the evening carrying another stack of recovered files. "We found 4 more contracts," she corrected anonymously, she said carefully. Ethan looked up immediately. 4. Melissa nodded. All linked to Gulf negotiations between 2021 and 2023. Ethan slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. And nobody realized? Apparently the correction notes were submitted through external linguistic review systems. Her initials were buried inside the metadata. Ethan stared quietly toward the city skyline glowing outside his office windows. 4 years he had trusted expensive consultants, elite law firms, and executives with Ivy League resumes. Yet hidden somewhere inside the machinery of his empire had been Clara Whitmore quietly fixing mistakes powerful men never even noticed. Not for recognition, not for promotions, just because the work mattered. That thought stayed with him longer than he expected. Across Queens, Clara stood behind the counter of the small restaurant, preparing coffee orders beneath warm yellow lights, while customers hurried inside escaping the cold November rain. Nobody there knew anything about billion-dollar fraud investigations or international contracts. To them, she was simply Clara, the quiet waitress who remembered regular customers' names and always worked extra shifts without complaining. "Table 6 wants more cream," her manager called. Clara nodded automatically and carried the tray toward the dining room. But before she reached the table, the entire restaurant suddenly went quiet. Clara looked up slowly. Outside the diner windows, a line of black luxury vehicles had stopped along the curb one after another beneath the rain-soaked streetlights. Drivers stepped out first carrying umbrellas. Then Ethan Blackwell emerged from the center vehicle wearing a dark overcoat over his charcoal suit. Manhattan traffic glowing behind him in blurred streaks of red and gold. Every customer inside the diner turned to stare. Clara froze beside the coffee station. Ethan stepped through the door calmly as the small bell above it rang softly. The contrast was almost surreal. Billionaire Manhattan power standing beneath flickering diner lights beside laminated breakfast menus and the smell of fresh soup. But Ethan did not seem uncomfortable there at all. His eyes found Clara immediately. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly. Ethan glanced briefly around the diner before speaking. "Can we talk?" The manager nearly dropped a stack of plates in shock. Clara hesitated before nodding toward an empty booth near the window. Rain rolled softly against the glass while Ethan removed his coat and sat across from her. Customers kept pretending not to stare. None of them were successful. Clara folded her hands together carefully. "This seems excessive for a conversation." Ethan looked directly at her. "You saved my company multiple times." Clara blinked once. "What?" Ethan placed a thin folder gently onto the table between them. "I found the archived contracts." Clara's expression changed immediately the moment she saw her own initials inside the documents. "See, Whitmore." Ethan watched the color slowly fade from her face. "You corrected legal discrepancies for Blackwell Global 3 years ago through freelance translation systems," he said quietly. "You prevented another acquisition fraud involving Dubai shipping rights." Clara lowered her eyes toward the table in silence. Ethan leaned slightly forward. "Why did you never tell anyone?" The diner noise around them seemed distant suddenly. Coffee machines hissed softly somewhere behind the counter while rain tapped gently against the windows. Clara finally answered without looking up. Because people only notice translators when something goes wrong. Ethan stared at her carefully. That is not true. Clara gave a faint, sad smile. Maybe not in your world. Ethan fell silent after that. Because for the first time in a very long time, the billionaire realized something painful. Clara Whitmore had spent years protecting powerful people who never once bothered learning her name. The diner remained unusually quiet long after Ethan Blackwell sat down across from Clara Whitmore. Outside, rain continued washing silver light across the Queen's sidewalks, while customers inside pretended to focus on coffee cups and newspapers instead of the billionaire seated beneath flickering diner lights. Clara stared down at the folder resting between them, her initials still visible on the legal reports Ethan had uncovered. See, Whitmore. Quiet evidence of years spent solving problems nobody knew existed. Ethan watched her carefully. You corrected international contracts for my company without compensation beyond freelance translation fees, he said quietly. You protected acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Clara gave a faint shrug. That was the job. Ethan leaned back slowly in the booth. No, he replied. That was integrity. Clara looked away toward the rain-streaked window beside them. Compliments still seemed to make her uncomfortable, almost suspicious. Most people would have used that talent differently, Ethan continued. Consulting firms would have paid you 7 figures. Clara smiled faintly beneath her breath. Most consulting firms do not offer health insurance fast enough to stop hospital bills. Ethan fell silent after that. Across the diner, Clara's manager quietly turned the open sign toward closed and locked the front door early without being asked. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever strange moment was unfolding between the billionaire and the waitress who somehow carried herself like neither title mattered very much anymore. Ethan glanced around the small diner. Worn booths, cracked tile near the counter, old jazz drifting softly from ceiling speakers. You stayed here all these years for your mother, he said. Clara nodded once. She stayed for me first. The simplicity of the answer settled heavily between them. Ethan suddenly realized Clara never described sacrifice dramatically. She spoke about it the same way other people discussed weather. Quietly, like survival had simply become routine. He opened the folder again and slid a final document toward her. Clara frowned slightly as she read the top line. Executive Director of International Linguistic Risk Analysis. Blackwell Global. Her eyes lifted immediately. Mr. Blackwell? Ethan, he corrected calmly. Clara ignored that completely. I cannot accept this. Why? Because people like me do not walk into buildings like yours and suddenly become executives. Ethan held her gaze evenly. People like you built buildings like mine. Men like me just put our names on them. Clara looked genuinely startled by that answer. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and removed the old silver fountain pen Sheikh Omar had gifted him the previous night. Then he placed it gently beside the contract offer. You spent years making sure powerful people did not lose everything because nobody else was paying attention, he said quietly. I think it is time somebody finally paid attention to you. The diner fell silent again. Even the coffee machine behind the counter had stopped hissing. Clara stared down at the offer while emotions moved carefully behind her calm expression. Fear, uncertainty, hope she clearly did not trust yet. My mother's treatment is expensive, she admitted softly. Then let me help. Clara looked up immediately. I do not want charity. Ethan shook his head once. Good, because I am offering respect. The words landed differently somehow. Clara's fingers slowly tightened around the edge of the paper. For years she had survived being overlooked because it hurt less than being disappointed. But sitting across from Ethan Blackwell now, she realized something unfamiliar. He was not looking at her like a waitress who surprised him. He was looking at her like an equal who should have been seen much sooner. Outside the diner, another line of black vehicles slowly pulled against the curb beneath the rain. Clara frowned softly toward the window. Ethan smiled faintly for the first time in days. Sheikh Omar insisted on coming personally. Moments later, the diner door opened again. Sheikh Omar entered carrying a large white box wrapped carefully in gold ribbon. Behind him stood several sharply dressed executives holding flower arrangements that looked wildly out of place inside the tiny queen's diner. Every employee inside froze completely. The sheik approached Clara warmly and placed his hand over his heart once more. "In my country," he said gently, "when someone protects your family's future, you stand when they enter the room." Then something extraordinary happened. Ethan Blackwell stood first, then Sheikh Omar's executives, then the diner staff. One by one, every person inside the small restaurant quietly rose to their feet around Clara Whitmore. The waitress who spent years unnoticed beneath fluorescent lights suddenly stood in the center of a silent room filled with people powerful enough to change cities. Yet none of them looked down at her anymore. Clara's eyes shimmered slightly as she looked around the diner in disbelief. Ethan simply watched her quietly from across the booth. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a room is not when someone wealthy speaks. It is when everyone finally understands who deserved respect all along.